Picture the scene. You spent a fortune on your PC, updated drivers, closed everything in the background, tweaked settings, watched FPS boost videos, and yet the new game runs worse than one from 5 years ago. Then comes the classic line, your PC is weak. But what if it isn't? Today I want to show you the real reason why many games are running worse even on powerful hardware, and why it has much more to do with optimization, rushed releases, shaders, asset streaming, and even design decisions than with you not having an RTX 5090 on your desk. I'm Matthew, and the video is about to start. I feel like we've reached a strange point. I look at a high-end PC or console and think, okay, here we go. But then the modern game opens with stutters, hitching, weird frame pacing, and FPS drops right when you want things to be smoothest. And it's not that feeling of my hardware is weak, it's more of an annoyance realizing that even with beefy equipment, you're still fighting with settings, day one patches, and promises that it will get better in the next update. What gets me is the inevitable question: why isn't technological progress automatically turning into a smoother experience? Every generation, the pitch is raw power, upscaling, ray tracing, AI. But in practice, the package comes with heavy reliance on image reconstruction, caches compiling mid-gameplay, and a general heaviness that doesn't seem proportional to the visual leap. Sometimes it feels like the industry has normalized launching at the limit and optimizing later, as if performance were an adjustable extra rather than part of the basics. And this completely messes with the perceived value of hardware. Because when you pay a premium for a new GPU, you're not just buying frames, you're buying peace of mind to plug in and play without friction, without having to become a performance technician. If the final result is just okay, even at the top, the message left behind is terrible. Either the hardware isn't worth the price, or the software isn't respecting its potential. And honestly, when consumers feel like they're paying to do troubleshooting, excitement turns into distrust very quickly. To me, the focus of the conversation needs to stay on the industry, not the user. You can't treat bad performance as the player's fault for not configuring it right, not having patience, or not having the perfect driver. The product is sold as an experience, not an IT project. If modern games are demanding more than necessary, the responsibility lies with those who decide deadlines, visual targets, pipelines, and optimization priorities. And until that changes, frustration will keep growing, even with the most advanced hardware on the market. I have the feeling that many games are entering a race of who is heavier instead of who does it better. Everything has to be gargantuan, ultra detailed, with thousands of particles, reflections on everything, and a world so dense it seems to scream, look how modern I am, only this is accompanied by increasingly poor efficiency. In the end, I'm left with the impression that the game is spending too many resources to deliver gains that, when it's time to play, don't always truly change the experience. When I look back to the eras where limitations were brutal, I even feel a bit nostalgic for the kind of creativity that it forced. There was no memory, no space, no leftover power, so people had to be smart with animation, visual readability, art direction, sound, and level design. And it's funny how, precisely because they couldn't solve it with muscle, many old games nailed their identity and clarity. You understood what was happening, and the game ran perfectly within the hardware's rules. Then comes the reflection that won't leave my head. Is this increase in technical complexity, in a way, inhibiting real innovation? Because when a studio has to spend a fortune and years just to build pipelines, hyper-realistic assets, and a massive world, there's less room left to take risks on new mechanics, different structures, or weird ideas that could become trends. It seems like the creative risk shifts from what if the gameplay is different to what if we add 30 more hours of map and 200 more details to the texture, as if that automatically meant evolution. And there's a cynical side I can't ignore. Sometimes it feels like more of a way to justify consumption cycles. If the game needs new hardware to run right, you create constant pressure to upgrade your card, console, monitor, SSD. And then the narrative becomes, The future has arrived. Even when the core of what matters, responsiveness, stability, polish, doesn't keep up. I'm not against technical advancement, quite the opposite. But I'd like to see more technology serving new experiences and less technology serving as an expensive storefront to prove the market still needs to turn. I've always found it curious how we treat photorealism as if it were the final boss of video games, when, for me, the thing that sticks most in memory is almost never the perfect texture of a rock. It's the art direction, the color palette, the way lighting tells a story, character designs you recognize from a distance, the identity of the world. There are games where you see a still image and already feel the atmosphere, and that's worth more than any skin pour rendered in 4K. And the best part is that a strong artistic style is usually a clever shortcut to immersion without crushing the hardware. When a team chooses a coherent aesthetic, be it stylized, minimalist, painterly, or dark, they better control what matters on screen and reduce that obsession with simulating everything. Instead of spending performance to reproduce reality, the game uses resources to reinforce legibility, rhythm, and feel, making the experience smoother and more complete. This makes me question the value of realism for realism's sake. When does it actually contribute to the essence of the game? Because there are cases where photorealism helps, of course, especially if the pitch is tension, horror, or a more grounded drama. But in many games, it just becomes an expensive showcase that ages quickly, and worse, sometimes it gets in the way because everything becomes visually the same and loses personality. I'd prefer 1,000 times a world that looks impossible but consistent over a real world that makes me feel nothing. In the end, I go back to the question I think is most important. What makes a game memorable visual fidelity or a creative vision that evokes emotions and reflections? I can remember exactly the mood, the aesthetic courage, the feeling of exploring certain places in games with unique styles, even years later. As for the impact of photorealism, it often just becomes a 5-minute wow, until you realize that what actually holds you is the direction, the design, and the soul behind the image. To me, ray tracing has become that feature that appears in trailers as if it were the definitive seal of next gen, but when it's time to play, I feel the cost more than the benefit. Often I turn it on, admire a reflection here and a shadow there for a few minutes, and shortly after I turn it off, when I see performance plummet, because nothing kills immersion more than losing fluidity and responsiveness. And this isn't an isolated impression. There is data showing massive FPS drops in certain scenarios when ray tracing comes into play. What bothers me is the aggressive marketing around it, as if ray tracing automatically meant a better game when it almost never touches the essence of gameplay. It can make lighting more convincing and give that touch of realism that fits some genres very well, but it's an atmosphere upgrade, not a mechanical one. And then you get that bitter trade-off. I get a more cinematic look, but I pay for it with stability, exactly what I value most when I want the controller to respond instantly. The reflection that remains is this genuine evolution or a push to sell hardware? Because the way it's treated, it seems the market needs a visible reason to justify the next card, and RT becomes the perfect argument. Beautiful in screenshots, heavy enough to require an upgrade, and easy to turn into a bullet point on boxes and presentations. At the same time, even those who defend it recognize it's a heavy technology and that techniques like DLSS and FSR act as lifesavers to make the package viable. There are more balanced alternatives that, when well used, deliver excellent results without this performance hit. Well done rasterization, good art direction, and clever lighting solutions already create beautiful and legible scenes, and for many people, myself included, that carries more weight than a perfect reflection. In the end, I'm not against ray tracing. I just think it should be sold as a luxury option and not as a moral obligation of the future, especially when the cost is the most important part of the game, playing it well. I feel that the obsession with native 4K has become a sort of display window goal. It looks beautiful in screenshots, impresses in trailers, but in practice, it often charges too high a price in fluidity. And for me, Fluidity isn't a luxury, it's part of the game's feel. A more responsive camera, more precise controls, less of a dragging sensation. When I see a game holding 4K at the expense of constant drops or a quality mode that feels stuttery, I just think, why am I prioritizing pixels if the game is losing its rhythm? What bothers me is that this focus on high resolution often turns into indirect pressure. If it's not 4K, it's not next gen. But the reality is that 60 frames per second or more changes how you feel the game, while the leap from well-done 1440p to native 4K, depending on the distance from your TV or monitor, is sometimes much less transformative than marketing makes it seem. That's where upscaling approaches come in. You accept that the image might not be microscopically perfect, but you gain consistency, stability, and that feeling that everything is in its place. And then comes the question I always ask myself in the middle of these discussions. At what point does this search for visual perfection start to compromise the enjoyment of the game? Because when I'm at the controls, I'm not analyzing a strand of hair, I'm reading the enemy, reaction time, animation, feedback, clarity. If maximum resolution is competing with stable frame times, I prefer a slightly less pure image and a game that responds as it should, especially in action, fighting, shooters, or anything that depends on timing. In the end, I also ask, who really benefits when the priority becomes native 4K above all else? The player who wants to play, or the commercial narrative that needs easy numbers to sell on boxes and trailers? Because 4K is a simple, universal, photogenic argument, while consistent, well-optimized game with solid frame pacing doesn't become an easy slogan. And that's where I think we need to invert the logic. Technology shouldn't serve to impress from afar, it should serve to make the game feel better in your hands. I feel a very specific frustration when I see a gorgeous game with perfect lighting and absurd textures, but inside, it's empty in the most predictable way possible. The story takes no risks, characters don't actually grow, and when you finish, you're left with the feeling that you consumed a spectacle, not lived an experience. And then I think, how did we advance so much in the shell and so little in what holds the game in memory? The biggest problem in my view is this stagnation in essential elements, narratives that don't provoke, physics that still feel like showcase items, and optimization that becomes a negotiable detail. It's as if the industry has accepted that players will tolerate hitches, weird bugs, and shallow systems as long as the trailer looks like cinema. But in practice, these invisible things are precisely what break immersion and make the controller lose its magic. I understand that graphics sell, it's easy to show in videos, screenshots, and side-by-side comparisons, but the question I can't avoid is, why are so many resources going into that and so little into depth? Why not bet on plots that actually trust the player's intelligence, that create discomfort, reflection, moral dilemmas, or at least conversations that don't sound like disguised tutorials? And why not push physics and interaction to a level where the world responds more credibly to what you do instead of just being a pretty backdrop where you touch things and nothing happens? I truly believe games could be more impactful if they invested more in stories that pull for critical thinking and in more realistic interactions. Not realistic as in looks like real life, but realistic in the sense of having consequence, consistency, and reaction. A game can have the most absurd graphics on the planet, but if it doesn't challenge me internally, if it doesn't make me think or feel something beyond wow, it evaporates quickly. And that's what I'd like to see become a priority. Less racing for shine, more courage to create experiences that stay with you after the screen goes dark. I have a very clear impression that the industry has slowly built an almost imposed update cycle. A new game arrives, carries that future-ready label, demands absurd resources, and suddenly hardware that had plenty of headroom 2 years ago is already treated as outdated. It's not just by chance. There is an entire ecosystem of marketing and partnerships between card manufacturers, console makers, engines, and studios pushing the message that you need more power all the time. And when you combine that with poorly optimized systems, this sense of planned obsolescence becomes hard to ignore. What bothers me is how this always puts the player in the guilty position. If the game doesn't run right, the implicit message is, your machine isn't keeping up, instead of, the software was over-engineered and poorly polished. Every generation, the discourse is similar. Now this is the definitive platform. This GPU is for years of peace of mind, until the next set of graphic buzzwords appears and magically transforms your current setup into entry level. It's a cycle that feeds sales but wears down the trust of those who just want to play well. The good part is that players aren't totally trapped in this. It's possible to resist, even if it's not simple. One way is to shift the focus of what you value. Instead of chasing the heaviest game of the moment, prioritize well-optimized creative experiences with good art direction and solid design, even if they aren't the visual peak. Another is to hold off on upgrades when the change is purely cosmetic. If the practical difference in your experience is minimal, not letting marketing decide your purchase moment is a way to break the cycle. And there's also the collective side, supporting studios that deliver polished games that run well on reasonable hardware, and publicly speaking up when a release arrives broken makes a difference in the long run. Buying less on impulse, waiting for performance reviews, and valuing games that innovate in mechanics, narrative, and systems, instead of just pixel counts, is a direct message to the industry. In the end, the more we prioritize intrinsic quality and creativity, and the less we fall into the needs a new card to be good trap, the more power we give to a market that respects the time and the wallet of those who play.